The school invited the millionaire father to the school to deal with his son's trouble with other student. When the father walked in, he froze when he saw the child sitting across from his son. That boy. The late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting golden patterns on the polished wooden floor. The room carried the faint scent of varnished string instruments and old sheet music, a mix of familiarity and quiet reverence. Students filtered in, their chatter filling the air with a pleasant hum, some adjusting their bows, others running through scales absent-mindedly, a few simply observing the grand piano at the front of the room, as if sizing up their competition. Roy stepped inside with measured footsteps, his posture straight, his fingers curled protectively around the edge of his music folder. His neatly pressed white shirt and carefully knotted tie hinted at someone who valued precision, order, and the kind of discipline that came from years of structured lessons. He walked towards the piano, its black surface reflecting the overhead lights, and placed his music sheets carefully on the stand. Across the room, a boy with unruly hair and a slightly wrinkled shirt leaned against a violin case, plucking at the strings idly. He was talking, no, laughing, at something a classmate had said, his voice carrying with an effortless charm. Alex exuded a natural confidence, the kind that came not from meticulous practice, but from an easy, unshaken belief in his own abilities. With a quick flick of his wrist, he brought his violin to his shoulder and played a few impromptu notes, casual, yet deliberately showy. A girl nearby giggled appreciatively. Roy barely spared him a glance, but Alex caught the movement. His eyes flicked toward the boy now settling at the piano, pausing mid-sentence. His brows pulled together slightly in confusion, as if his brain was trying to register something it wasn't quite prepared for. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, familiar, yet not. The resemblance was uncanny. Roy, feeling the weight of someone's gaze, finally looked up, locking eyes with Alex. The room around them seemed to momentarily blur into the background, swallowed by an invisible tension that neither of them could quite name. Alex was the first to recover, his lips curling into a smirk, one eyebrow lifting ever so slightly. "Huh," he mused, voice carrying a teasing edge. Didn't know this was a twin convention. A few nearby students turned to look, intrigued by the unexpected resemblance. Roy exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly as he regarded Alex with a cool, unimpressed gaze. "Funny," he said evenly, "because I was just wondering who let the budget version of me in here." A ripple of laughter passed through the students. Alex's smirk faltered just slightly before he let out a low chuckle, amused rather than offended. "Well, I hate to break it to you, piano boy, but you're looking at the deluxe edition." "Deluxe edition," Roy mused, tapping a finger against the piano keys absent-mindedly. "Interesting choice of words, considering you seem to be running on pure arrogance rather than actual skill." The instructor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of quiet authority, stepped in before things could escalate. "Settle down, everyone," she called, her tone carrying just enough warning to command attention. "Let's begin with introductions before we start playing. Since we have a mix of new and returning students, I'd like each of you to share your name and your instrument." The students began their introductions, some nervous, some eager, some barely audible over the rustling of music sheets and shifting chairs. When it was Alex's turn, he leaned back slightly in his chair, resting his violin against his shoulder with practiced ease. "Alex Howard, violin," he said, voice self-assured, eyes flicking briefly toward Roy. A moment later, Roy stood, his posture impeccable, his voice measured. "Roy Miller, piano." The instructor gave a small nod before turning to the class. "All right, now that we know each other, let's start with an exercise in coordination. I'll pair you up for a short duet, violin and piano." Roy felt a sinking feeling in his stomach before she even spoke the next words. "Roy, Alex, you two will play together." There was an audible pause in the room before a few students exchanged amused glances. Roy inhaled slowly, smoothing the cuffs of his sleeves. Alex leaned back in his chair, an almost lazy grin tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well," Alex drawled, "this should be fun." Roy merely lifted an eyebrow, his voice as even as ever. "For one of us, at least." The two boys moved to their respective instruments, the silence between them charged with unspoken competition. Alex positioned his violin, fingers flexing around the bow with instinctive ease. Roy placed his hands over the keys, his posture rigid with focus. The instructor gave a small nod, signaling them to begin. At first, the music was chaos. Roy played with crisp precision, every note exact, his fingers dancing over the keys with an almost mechanical perfection. Alex, however, played as if he were having a conversation rather than following the script. His bow moved fluidly, his notes stretching and bending just enough to give them flair. The result? A complete lack of harmony. It was a battle disguised as a duet, Roy trying to rein Alex in, Alex resisting the structure Roy tried to impose. By the time the final note rang out, the room was filled with an awkward silence. A girl in the back stifled a laugh. Someone clapped, sarcastically. The instructor sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. That was an experience. Alex turned to Roy, grinning. "Not bad, piano boy, almost kept up with me." Roy, unfazed, calmly gathered his sheet music. "Interesting interpretation," he said coolly, "but I don't think disaster was the emotion we were aiming for." The instructor cleared her throat, cutting them both off. "You two will need extra practice together. I want to see actual coordination next time." The room filled with hushed murmurs as the students packed up, some still throwing amused glances at the two boys. As they walked out of the classroom, Alex nudged Roy with his elbow, voice light with mischief. "Hope you like losing, because you're stuck with me." Roy didn't even spare him a glance. "No worries. I'm used to dealing with amateurs." Their rivalry had only just begun. The scent of freshly polished floors mixed with the faint notes of unfinished melodies drifting through the music school hallways. A few students lingered in small clusters, discussing their practice pieces, their voices blending with the occasional pluck of a stray guitar string or the soft hum of a cello being tuned. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, painting slanted golden stripes across the wooden floorboards. Inside the practice room, the tension was palpable. Alex, perched on the edge of his chair, tilted his violin under his chin with an air of exaggerated nonchalance. His fingers danced lightly over the strings as he played an impromptu, wildly embellished rendition of the piece they were supposed to rehearse. The notes twisted and stretched beyond the composer's intent. Each exaggerated flourish meant to irritate the boy seated across from him. Roy, sitting at the piano, exhaled slowly through his nose. Without looking up, he turned a page of sheet music, too forcefully, the crisp sound slicing through the room like a conductor's baton hitting a music stand. Alex smirked, lifting an eyebrow. "You really know how to turn a page dramatically, huh?" Roy, unimpressed, adjusted his posture. "I didn't realize we were warming up for a circus performance. You planning to juggle while you play next?" A few students, already entertained by their ongoing feud, exchanged knowing glances. Their instructor, Ms. Morgan, had noticed the friction, but had yet to intervene beyond an occasional exasperated sigh. The two boys weren't openly disruptive, but their rivalry bled into everything. Each duet was less of a collaboration and more of a musical duel, each session thick with the unspoken challenge of who could outplay the other. By the time the break rolled around, Roy and Alex had developed an unspoken ritual. Alex would deliberately tune his violin during any conversation Roy attempted to have, making sure the high-pitched strings drowned out his words, while Roy, in turn, flipped his sheet music in sharp, deliberate motions whenever Alex focused on a difficult passage. "I swear they do this on purpose," one student muttered, watching them. "They bicker like old men," another added, shaking his head. Their classmates had begun taking bets on how long it would take before one of them snapped. At home, their grievances followed them like an unwanted echo. Roy, his sweater neatly folded over the back of his chair, sat at his desk, rubbing his temples as he replayed the day's practice in his mind. Across the room, his laptop screen glowed softly, his mother's face appearing in a small window as she called from Boston. "So, how's the new music class?" Angela's voice was warm, but slightly distant, her attention split between Roy and whatever papers she was flipping through. "It'd be great if I didn't have to deal with him," Roy muttered, stretching his arms. Angela's brow furrowed slightly. "Who?" Roy leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the desk. "Some violinist. Thinks he's a prodigy. Can't play in sync to save his life." Angela hummed, unimpressed. "Sounds like a typical artist's ego. You'll figure out how to work together." Roy made a non-committal noise, already regretting bringing it up. Across town, Alex lounged on the couch, tossing a small rubber ball in the air and catching it one-handed, while his housekeeper Maria bustled around the kitchen. The rhythmic thud-thud of the ball against his palm filled the room. "So how was class today?" Maria asked as she chopped vegetables, used to Alex's post-school complaints. "Annoying," Alex said immediately, rolling onto his side. "There's this guy, piano guy, thinks he's the king of tempo, plays like he's conducting a funeral." Maria chuckled. "And what about you? You played perfectly, I assume." "Obviously." Alex tossed the ball again. "If he loosened up a little, maybe we wouldn't sound like two musicians trapped in different time zones." Maria shook her head, unimpressed. "Maybe if you didn't play like you were trying to start a fire, he wouldn't be so stiff." Alex scoffed, but said nothing. Meanwhile, Keith sat in his home office, his phone buzzing with an email notification. Alex's earlier complaints about his frustrating classmate had barely registered in his mind. He had nodded vaguely, responding with a neutral, "That's nice, son," before moving on to more pressing matters, business mergers, contract negotiations, numbers that made sense. Had he been paying attention, he might have noticed the strange tone in Alex's voice, the slight curiosity, the edge of something unspoken beneath the frustration. But he wasn't. And so the rivalry continued. Back in class the next day, the silent war resumed. Alex arrived first, his violin case already resting on the chair beside him. When Roy walked in, their eyes met for a brief second before Roy turned away, setting his music on the stand with controlled precision. Alex grinned. "Miss me?" Roy slid onto the piano bench without answering. Ms. Morgan clapped her hands together, gesturing toward them. "All right, you two, again, and this time try to listen to each other." They played. It started the same as before, Roy maintaining rigid control, Alex testing boundaries. But somewhere, between the third and fourth measure, something shifted. For the briefest moment, Alex followed Roy's lead, his violin threading effortlessly through the piano structure, and Roy, without realizing it, adjusted, giving Alex just enough space to breathe into the music. It lasted less than 5 seconds. Then, as if realizing they had momentarily agreed on something, they both snapped back into their old patterns. The class groaned. Ms. Morgan exhaled, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Again," she said. Neither Roy nor Alex would admit it, but in those few seconds where their music had blended, it had felt effortless, natural, like something that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The rain had started sometime in the early afternoon, draping the city in a muted grey. Water pooled in the dips of sidewalks, catching the occasional glare of passing headlights. Inside the music school, the air smelled faintly of damp coats and freshly polished floors, mingling with the sharper scent of rosin dust and aged wood. Roy sat at the piano bench, absently tapping his fingers against the edge of the keys as he waited for class to begin. It wasn't an impatient motion, just a habitual rhythm, something to occupy his hands while his mind replayed the last disastrous duet. Across the room, Alex lounged in his chair, absent-mindedly running his bow along the edge of his music stand, his fingers drumming against the wood in an unconscious beat. They weren't looking at each other, but the gestures were identical. A few classmates exchanged amused glances. "You ever notice they do the same things?" one girl whispered to her friend. "Like, exactly the same," the other agreed, stifling a laugh, as both boys, still oblivious, tilted their heads slightly to the side, mirroring each other's expressions of mild boredom. Alex, unaware of the murmurs, turned toward Roy just as the instructor walked in. "Hey, Maestro," he called, voice dripping with mock respect. "You ready to finally loosen up and play like a human?" Roy sighed, stretching his fingers over the piano keys. "And you? Ready to stop playing like an over-caffeinated street performer?" Alex smirked. "No promises." Ms. Morgan clapped her hands together, signaling for quiet. "Let's try the duet again. This time I want you to actually listen to each other instead of turning it into a competition." There was a beat of silence before Alex muttered, "No guarantees on that either." The first few notes were cautious, measured. Roy led with steady precision, his fingers moving across the keys with disciplined grace. Alex followed, his bow gliding over the strings, his strokes just a touch more expressive than the music required. Then, somewhere in the third measure, Alex decided to improvise. A playful embellishment, a deviation from the original phrasing, just subtle enough to test Roy's reaction. Roy's hands stilled instantly, the last note hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. "If you want to play solo," he said, his voice cool but edged with irritation, "be my guest." Alex, unfazed, spun his violin in his hands. "Relax, Maestro. It's called interpretation. You should try it sometime." Roy exhaled sharply, adjusting the sheet music as if that alone could erase the past 30 seconds. "I interpret music the way it was meant to be played. You interpret it like a stray cat messing with a violin string." Stray cat. That's new, Alex mused, tapping his bow against the music stand. What's next? Street magician? Pirate bard? Roy ignored him and started again, this time playing the opening measures faster. Not enough for Ms. Morgan to immediately notice, but enough that Alex had to scramble to adjust his tempo. Alex's smirk faded. His grip on the bow tightened. For the first time, he was being tested. By the fourth measure, a single bead of sweat rolled down the back of his neck. His fingers moved quickly, trying to match Roy's unexpected speed without losing control of his bowing. Roy's hands remained steady, his expression unreadable. Alex's jaw clenched. "All right, fine." He sped up too, trying to regain the lead, but Roy anticipated it, shifting the tempo yet again. A disjointed clash of piano and violin erupted between them, their stubbornness overriding any semblance of musical harmony. Ms. Morgan slammed her hands onto the conductor's stand. The sound echoed through the room. "Enough!" Both boys stopped immediately, still locked in silent battle. Ms. Morgan took a slow breath, pressing her fingers to her temples before fixing them with a withering stare. "If you two don't learn how to play as partners, I'm pulling you from the recital, and you can explain to the entire your elementary school why you failed a duet." A ripple of laughter spread through the classroom. Roy and Alex, still catching their breath, scowled in perfect unison. They crossed their arms at the same time. More laughter. Alex frowned. "Did you just—" Roy's eyes narrowed. "No, you did." The instructor sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "Class dismissed. You two, stay." The rest of the students filed out, still chuckling, while Roy and Alex remained in their seats, arms still stubbornly crossed. Ms. Morgan leaned back against the piano, watching them with the tired patience of someone who had seen every kind of musical disaster imaginable. "You're both talented," she said, her tone even. "But if you keep playing against each other, instead of with each other, you're wasting it." Neither boy spoke. Miss Morgan studied them for another moment, then gestured toward the door. Go home. Come back tomorrow, and try again. Together. Roy stood first, collecting his sheet music with methodical care. Alex slung his violin case over his shoulder, stuffing his bow inside haphazardly. They walked out side by side, neither looking at the other. In the hallway, Alex let out a low breath, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the tension. You know, he mused, for someone who claims not to like me, you sure spent a lot of energy trying to throw me off. Roy adjusted the strap of his bag. For someone who acts like he doesn't care, you sure didn't like losing control of the tempo. Alex stopped walking. Roy glanced at him. A slow, reluctant grin spread across Alex's face. You're going to be a pain in the ass, aren't you? Roy finally allowed a small, knowing smirk. Absolutely. The leaves glistened under the faint morning drizzle, droplets collecting along their jagged edges before slipping down to the damp soil below. The park smelled of wet earth and autumn decay, a mix of crisp air and something faintly sharp, like the remnants of a summer long past. Alex knelt by a patch of wild foliage, his fingers ghosting over the edges of a particular set of leaves, dark green, slightly glossy, veins running like tiny rivers through them. He'd read about these once, a harmless-looking plant with an irritating secret. A grin stretched across his face. By the time he slipped into the music school, his hands were clean, but his mind was buzzing with anticipation. Across town, Roy stood in front of his piano at home, carefully testing the viscosity of the oil he had poured onto a folded tissue. It was almost weightless, clear, barely noticeable unless one knew to look for it. He imagined Alex swaggering into class, full of that unbearable confidence, stepping onto his usual spot, only to find himself sprawled on the floor in a graceless heap. Roy pressed his lips together, trying not to smile. This was going to be good. The music room smelled the same as always, aged wood, dust from old books, the faint tang of resin from violin bows. Students trickled in, shaking off their umbrellas and chatting about the weather. Roy walked to the piano, his steps unhurried, his face carefully neutral. He pulled out his sheet music, adjusted the bench, and sat. A small part of him wished he could stay and watch when Alex took his first slippery step. On the other side of the room, Alex sauntered in, shaking a few raindrops from his sleeves. He tossed his violin case onto his chair, leaning casually against the backrest as he watched Roy settle in. "Early today, maestro," he drawled. Roy didn't look up. "Unlike some people, I like to prepare." Alex smirked, but his attention flickered toward the piano bench. He leaned slightly forward, barely containing his amusement. Roy, oblivious, was moments away from regretting everything. Just as both boys braced for their respective traps to spring, Miss Morgan entered, brisk as always. "All right, everyone, take your seats." She rubbed her temples as if already anticipating the trouble ahead. "We're running through the ensemble piece first." The moment she approached the piano, Roy's stomach dropped. He barely had time to react before she sat down. The first few seconds passed in painful silence. Then it began. Ms. Morgan shifted slightly, then again. Her movements turned rigid. Her expression twitched, fingers hesitating over the keys. A slow realization dawned on Alex, his smirk faltering. Roy could already feel his soul leaving his body. She cleared her throat, shifting again. Then, suddenly, she jumped up from the bench, nearly knocking over the sheet music in the process. "What in the—" She swiped at the back of her skirt, her face contorted in horror. "Why is this—" The room was deadly silent. Roy and Alex stared at each other, wide-eyed, the shared realization clicking into place. They had gone too far. Ms. Morgan's glare swept over the class, her breathing controlled but sharp. "Who did this?" No one spoke. Her voice dropped an octave. "I said, who did this?" Roy swallowed, his fingers digging into his palms. He didn't dare glance at Alex, but he could feel the tension radiating from him. Then, as if the universe decided their suffering wasn't quite enough, Ms. Morgan took a single step forward, onto the very spot where Roy had poured the oil. Her foot slid, her balance wavered. And then, chaos. She barely caught herself, gripping the edge of the piano to steady her stance, her face a mixture of shock and barely contained fury. The class collectively inhaled. Someone let out an awkward cough. And then, in the smallest, most unfortunate lapse of judgment, Alex laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even deliberate. Just a quiet, strangled noise of disbelief escaping before he could stop it. Miss Morgan turned sharply. Roy closed his eyes. "We're dead." "Who?" she enunciated, her tone dangerously controlled. "Did this? Stand up now before I report this directly to the administration." Silence hung heavy in the room. Alex exhaled through his nose, shoulders stiff. Then, in an almost reluctant motion, he pushed back his chair and stood. A beat later, Roy followed. They exchanged a glance. Not one of amusement, not even regret. Just mutual, silent suffering. Ms. Morgan's nostrils flared. "Parents. Now." Alex groaned under his breath. "Oh, come on." She cut him off with a glare that could have burned through stone. "Not a word." Roy ran a hand down his face. Keith was going to love this, and Angela. He prayed she'd still be in Boston. The city hummed with the usual midday rhythm. Car horns, hurried footsteps, the occasional distant siren. But inside the music school, all was unnervingly still. The air in the principal's office felt thick, almost suffocating, the kind of silence that stretched tight, like a drawn bowstring, just waiting for something, or someone, to snap. Roy and Alex sat on opposite ends of a long wooden bench, their bodies turned slightly away from each other, as if the extra inches of distance could somehow lessen the weight of their impending doom. Roy stared at the floor, his fingers intertwined, while Alex fidgeted with the hem of his sleeve, his knee bouncing slightly. They hadn't spoken since Ms. Morgan had made the call. Neither had much to say. The door creaked open. Roy looked up, expecting to see Ms. Morgan returning with another scolding, but the figure in the doorway was unfamiliar to him, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, a sharpness in his gaze that was softened only by the evident irritation clouding his expression. Alex stiffened beside him. Keith Howard exhaled sharply, his fingers pinching the bridge of his nose as he stepped inside. "Which one of you am I here for?" he asked, though his eyes had already landed on Alex. Alex lifted a hand half-heartedly. "Guilty." Keith muttered something under his breath before closing the door behind him, his expensive watch catching the dim light. His presence filled the space instantly, an aura of command that suggested he had walked straight out of a high-rise office and into this absurd situation without missing a beat. But before anyone could speak, there was another knock. The door swung open again, and this time, Roy felt something inside him go still. The woman in the doorway looked tired. Not in the way Ms. Morgan looked tired, not the way Keith looked irritated, but a deeper kind of exhaustion, the kind carried in her shoulders, in the slight crease between her brows. She set down her bag, smoothing her hair back as she stepped inside. Angela. Roy barely had time to process his confusion before she spotted Alex. Her breath hitched. It wasn't a dramatic reaction, not a gasp, not a stumble, but something in her expression shifted, something raw and barely contained flashing across her features before she caught herself. Keith turned at the movement, his own expression hardening when he met Angela's gaze. Silence. Something heavy, unspoken, thickened the air between them. Roy swallowed. Angela's eyes flickered between Keith, Alex, and finally, Roy. Her face paled slightly. Keith clenched his jaw. Roy wasn't sure why, but the tension in the room had suddenly changed. This wasn't just about a prank gone wrong anymore. Miss Morgan, oblivious to the hurricane forming between the four of them, cleared her throat. "Mr. Howard, Miss Miller, thank you for coming." Angela's gaze lingered on Alex before she turned to the teacher, nodding stiffly. "What exactly happened?" "These two," Ms. Morgan gestured toward Roy and Alex with barely restrained exasperation, "decided to engage in a completely unacceptable act of sabotage today, involving hazardous materials, and nearly caused me serious injury in the process." Keith's expression darkened. Hazardous materials. Roy sank slightly lower in his seat. Angela shot him a sharp look. "Roy?" Ms. Morgan exhaled, rubbing her temples. "One of them," she continued, "thought it would be amusing to put an itching agent on the piano bench. The other decided to pour oil onto the floor, where Alex plays violin." Keith turned to Alex. "Oil?" Alex pointed at Roy. "His idea." Angela crossed her arms. "Leaves?" Roy pointed at Alex. "His idea." Ms. Morgan inhaled deeply, the kind of breath a person takes before deciding whether to resign entirely or see a situation through. Keith dragged a hand down his face. "For the love of—" Angela pinched the bridge of her nose. Roy and Alex, in unspoken agreement, kept their mouths shut. Ms. Morgan clasped her hands together. Ordinarily, this level of misconduct would result in suspension from the recital. "However," she continued, leveling them both with a stern glare, "considering your musical abilities and the fact that this was, however reckless, not done with malicious intent, I am giving you a choice." Both boys straightened slightly. "You either work together, seriously, and fix your duet before the recital," she said, "or you are both out. No second chances." A thick silence settled between them. Angela sighed. "Roy?" Roy hesitated, then, with visible reluctance, gave a stiff nod. Keith arched an eyebrow at Alex. Alex crossed his arms. "Fine, but only because he needs my help." Roy shot him a look. Ms. Morgan exhaled. "Good. Then we're done here. Parents, a word outside." Angela and Keith exchanged another unreadable glance before following Ms. Morgan into the hallway. The second the door shut, Roy let out a slow breath. "That was—" Alex slumped against the bench. "The worst 10 minutes of my life." Roy huffed. "You weren't the one who had to hear my mum's voice hit that register." Alex groaned. "My dad's was worse. It was the disappointed businessman tone." They fell into a mutual silence. Roy hesitated. Then, after a beat, he glanced at Alex. "She looked at you." Alex frowned. "Huh? Angela?" Roy's voice was quieter now. "She looked at you, like she knew you." Alex blinked, processing that. His usual smirk faltered. Outside in the hallway, Angela and Keith stood apart, neither speaking immediately. Angela crossed her arms. "So?" Keith studied her, his gaze unreadable. "So?" A pause. Angela let out a short, humorless laugh. 9 years. Keith exhaled. "Yeah." Another silence. This one heavier. Ms. Morgan coughed awkwardly, stepping away to give them space. Angela finally looked up, her voice softer. "He's... Alex." Keith's jaw tightened. "And Roy?" Angela nodded, exhaling shakily. Neither of them said what they were really thinking. They didn't have to. Does this interesting and lovely story make you excited? If so, please leave a comment honey in the PHSIA below. The cafe was quieter than expected for a weekday afternoon. The low hum of conversation blended with the occasional clink of cups against saucers, and the smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of rain still lingering in the air. Angela sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers curled around the ceramic warmth of her coffee cup, but she had barely taken a sip. Her eyes darted between Alex and Roy, her gaze lingering a second too long on the boy she hadn't seen in 9 years. Keith sat across from her, his posture straighter than usual, his hands clasped loosely on the table. He wasn't looking at her, not directly, but every so often, his gaze flickered in her direction before settling on his untouched espresso. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. "We should have told them," Keith murmured at last, his voice controlled but not emotionless. Roy exhaled, shifting in his seat. So, we're twins? His tone was casual, but there was something in his eyes, something searching. Alex smirked, nudging him lightly. Guess that explains why you're almost as cool as me. Roy huffed, shaking his head. Almost? Please. Their playful jabs filled the air for a brief moment. The weight of the conversation momentarily lifted. But it didn't last. Angela finally set down her cup, exhaling slowly. I suppose we owe you both an explanation, she said, her voice softer now. Keith's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Angela took a breath, steadying herself. Your father and I met in college. He was persistent. Keith let out a quiet scoff, finally looking at her. That's one way to put it. Angela gave a small, humorless smile. He worked in finance even back then. Always had his eye on something bigger. I was in film school, convinced I was going to write the next great screenplay. She paused, tracing the rim of her cup with her thumb. We got married young. Too young, maybe. Keith glanced down at his hands, his fingers tightening slightly. We were good together at first. Angela nodded. We were, but we wanted different things. You were already climbing the corporate ladder, and I was chasing stories no one cared about. Alex frowned. So, what happened? Angela's throat bobbed as she swallowed. I got pregnant. Keith's lips pressed into a thin line. With you two. Roy and Alex exchanged a glance. It was a surprise, Angela admitted. A good one, but it changed everything. Keith's voice was quieter now. I was working more, trying to build something stable for all of us. But that meant I was gone most of the time. And when I was home, I was exhausted. Angela looked down. And I was resentful. I felt like I was raising two newborns alone while you were off in boardrooms. Keith exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. We fought. A lot. All the time, Angela murmured. We didn't know how to meet in the middle. Roy's voice was tentative. So you split up? Angela nodded, her fingers tightening around her cup again. We tried to make it work, but one day after one of the worst arguments we'd ever had, I realized we weren't fixing anything. We were just hurting each other. So we ended it. Keith's expression was unreadable. And then came the real fight. Alex leaned forward slightly. What fight? Keith's throat worked, but it was Angela who answered. We couldn't agree on custody. Roy blinked. Custody? Angela gave a small, tired nod. Neither of us wanted to be the parent who only got weekends, and at the same time, neither of us was willing to let go of the future we thought we needed. She looked at Keith now. So we did the worst thing possible. We split you up. The words settled like a weight in the air. Roy's fingers curled into fists. You just decided to separate us. Angela swallowed. It wasn't a decision we made lightly, Roy. I swear. It was supposed to be temporary. Keith's voice was gruff. We told ourselves we'd revisit it, but life happened. Angela let out a quiet, bitter laugh. More like we let life happen. I got job offers, a screenwriting opportunity I'd been waiting for, and Keith was building his company, barely keeping his head above water at the time. We told ourselves that in a few years we'd sit down and figure it out, but those years kept slipping away. Roy looked down at his lap, his jaw clenched. Alex's usual smirk was gone, his fingers tapping against the table in a slow, restless rhythm. Keith sighed. I should have reached out. Angela's voice was barely above a whisper. So should I. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Roy exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Wow, that's really messed up. Alex huffed out a breath. Understatement of the year. Angela's expression crumpled slightly. I know, and I'm sorry. Both of us are. Keith looked at the boys, his gaze softer now. We can't undo what happened, but we can figure out what happens next. A silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't quite so heavy. Roy glanced at Alex. Well, at least now I know why you're so insufferable. Alex smirked, nudging him again. Family trait, I guess. Angela let out a small laugh, and even Keith cracked a smile. It wasn't a perfect moment, but it was a start. The evening sky had begun its slow descent into dusk, streaks of pale orange fading into the deepening blue. Inside the cafe, the air remained thick with the weight of old wounds and unspoken words. But there was a tentative thread of something else now, a fragile connection, the beginning of something not quite whole, but no longer broken beyond repair. Angela glanced down at her coffee, now lukewarm and untouched. Keith, ever the businessman, had barely touched his espresso, though his fingers occasionally drummed against the table as if restless. Roy and Alex, having long since finished their playful jabs, had settled into a quieter sort of processing, their shoulders drawn but no longer rigid. Then Keith's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and something flickered across his face, brief but unmistakable. A shift in posture, a tightening of his jaw. He hesitated, then exhaled sharply before answering. Yeah. Angela barely registered the voice on the other end, but the shift in Keith's tone was enough. The curt, clipped responses, the way his eyes darted toward Alex, then back to his coffee. Now? Keith sighed. Fine, I'll meet you outside. Alex, who had been slouching in his seat, straightened slightly, his expression unreadable. Angela set her cup down with a quiet clink. Who was that? Keith didn't meet her eyes. Beverly! Angela's lips parted slightly, but whatever words she had lined up never made it past her throat. Instead, she nodded once, slow and deliberate, before reaching for her purse. Alex ran a hand through his hair, his smirk forced. Oh, great. I was just thinking this needed to get more awkward. Roy, who had been watching his father closely, frowned. Who's Beverly? Keith sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. She's... He hesitated, and that hesitation alone was enough to make something tighten in Angela's chest. My dad's very young, very ambitious girlfriend, Alex supplied dryly. She's a delight. Roy's brow furrowed. Huh? Angela's fingers curled slightly against the edge of the table, though her voice remained neutral. She wants to meet you here. Keith exhaled, his frustration evident. She's already outside. Roy watched as Alex's expression darkened ever so slightly, though it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He filed that reaction away for later. Before anyone could say another word, the cafe door swung open, and in walked her. Beverly moved like someone used to being observed. Tall, effortlessly poised, she carried herself with the smooth confidence of someone who had long since mastered the art of presenting the perfect image. Her hair was sleek, her makeup impeccable, and the red coat draped over her shoulders was chosen with purpose, to stand out, to demand attention. And she was smiling. Angela felt her own spine straighten. Keith, Beverly purred, her tone smooth as silk. I was wondering what was taking so long. Keith stood, but the motion wasn't fluid. It was stiff, restrained. We were finishing up. Beverly's gaze flickered toward Angela, and for the briefest second, something sharp gleamed behind her practiced expression. But she masked it quickly, turning on a sweeter charm as she extended a perfectly manicured hand. You are? She asked. Angela Miller. Angela quickly replied, pulling out her business card. Beverly met the handshake, her grip firm. I think I've heard of you. Nice to meet you. She glanced at Keith as she said this. Alex let out a quiet snort. Beverly's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she turned her attention to Roy. If she is Angela, you must be Keith's other son. Her tone was pleasant, but there was something about the way she said other that made Roy's frown deepen. Roy, to his credit, nodded politely. Yeah. And you're Beverly. That's me. She beamed, tilting her head slightly. It's so wonderful that you're all reconnecting. Keith told me how complicated everything was, but I'm sure you'll work it all out. There was something saccharine in her voice, something too polished. Angela glanced at Keith, but his face was unreadable. Beverly looped her arm through Keith's without hesitation. We should go, darling. The dinner reservation isn't going to hold forever. Alex stiffened beside Roy, his jaw tensing. Keith hesitated, his gaze briefly flickering between his sons before nodding. Yeah, we should go. Angela exhaled, forcing a small, tight smile. Of course, you must have plans. Beverly tilted her head, her smile just a bit too victorious. You don't mind, do you? Angela ignored the question entirely, instead looking at Roy. I assume you're coming with me? Roy, who'd been watching the entire exchange with quiet calculation, nodded. Yeah, I'll see you later, Alex. Alex's jaw twitched slightly, but he only nodded. Yeah. As Keith turned toward the door, Alex shoved his hands into his pockets and followed, his expression unreadable. Roy watched him go, watched the way his father barely glanced back before stepping into the evening air with Beverly at his side. Something cold settled in Roy's chest. Angela watched too, her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her purse. She didn't say a word as the door closed behind them. The cafe felt quieter now. Roy let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. That was weird, right? Angela picked up her coffee, took a slow sip, then exhaled. Extremely. The city had settled into its nighttime rhythm, streetlights flickering to life, the soft hum of distant traffic filling the spaces between hurried footsteps. Inside their respective homes, Alex and Roy processed the evening in two very different ways. At Keith's penthouse, Alex lounged on the living room couch, tossing a tennis ball against the wall in a steady rhythm. His housekeeper, Maria, bustled around the kitchen, muttering about dinner. The place was sleek, modern, too pristine, too curated, like a magazine spread rather than a home. Maria finally turned, crossing her arms. So, are you going to tell me what's on your mind, or do I have to guess? Alex caught the ball mid-air and smirked. Did I ever mention I have a mother? Maria rolled her eyes. You always had a mother, sweetheart. Yeah, but I mean, I met her. His voice was lighter than usual, but something real flickered beneath it. Like, officially, Angela, and get this, Roy is my twin. Maria's eyebrows shot up. Oh my God. Alex grinned, sitting up. Crazy, right? I thought I had this whole story figured out. Billionaire dad, no mom, raised by you and, you know, the occasional business trip nanny. But turns out, all this time, she was out there. And she actually wanted me. Maria wiped her hands on a dish towel, watching him carefully. And how does that make you feel? Alex hesitated, tossing the ball once more, then catching it. Like I won the lottery and didn't even buy a ticket. Maria chuckled. Sounds like you got a good deal then. Alex let the words settle before leaning back against the couch with a deep sigh. Yeah, well, not everyone's thrilled about it. Enter Beverly. Maria groaned. That woman. Alex smirked. Saw her in action today. She does this thing where she smiles but looks like she's sizing you up for a funeral at the same time. Maria clicked her tongue. She has her claws in your father. No. Like a falcon grabbing a rabbit. Alex sat up suddenly, tossing the ball aside. And I'm telling you right now, Maria, she hates the idea of my parents being in the same room. I mean, she was practically radiating stay away from my rich boyfriend vibes. Maria folded her arms. And you? What do you want? Alex tapped his fingers against the coffee table, thinking. I want to see what happens if my parents have a real conversation. without distractions, without Beverly. Maria's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Ah, you have a plan." "Of course I have a plan," Alex said, already reaching for his phone. Meanwhile, at Angela's apartment, Roy was stretched out on the floor beside his mother's desk, staring at the ceiling. The soft glow of her laptop screen illuminated the room as she typed, the rhythmic clicks of the keyboard filling the otherwise quiet space. Roy glanced over. "Do you think Keith would let me visit him sometime?" Angela paused mid-sentence, then slowly turned her chair to face him. "You want to see him?" Roy shrugged, picking at the fabric of his sweater. "I mean, yeah. I never really thought about it before. I didn't know I had a dad who actually wanted to know me. But now, feels kind of stupid not to." Angela exhaled, leaning back. He'd probably be thrilled to hear that. Roy considered that, then frowned. "Well, Beverly might strangle me first." Angela smirked. "I could ask Keith to take her." Roy laughed, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Alex. He picked up immediately. "What?" Alex's voice was a low whisper, filled with mischief. "We're setting up our parents." Roy blinked. "Huh?" Alex sighed dramatically. "Dinner. Just them. No Beverly. Think of it as a science experiment." Roy hesitated, but the idea didn't sound entirely terrible. "What's the plan?" Alex grinned on the other end. "Leave that to me." 2 days later, Keith and Angela arrived at the same restaurant under very different pretenses. Keith thought he was meeting a business contact. Angela thought she was meeting an old colleague. They both realized, at exactly the same moment, that they had been set up. Angela crossed her arms as she took her seat across from him. "I assume this wasn't your idea." Keith sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Alex." Roy, hiding behind a decorative plant across the room, smirked. Alex, beside him, whispered, "I told you this would be gold." Roy rolled his eyes. "It's going to be something, that's for sure." Back at the table, Keith and Angela sat in awkward silence for a moment before Keith cleared his throat. "Well, since we're here, we might as well eat." Angela studied him for a second, then nodded. "Fine. But you're paying." Keith smirked. "That's fair." As the evening went on, the conversation started stiff, polite. Then, somewhere between the appetizers and the main course, something shifted. They stopped talking like exes and started talking like people. Keith told a story about his early days in finance, how he once accidentally called an investor the wrong name for an entire dinner meeting. Angela laughed, shaking her head. "I don't believe that. You were always so prepared." Keith grinned. "Well, even I screw up sometimes." Angela stirred her drink. "That's oddly comforting." Across the restaurant, Alex nudged Roy. "Look at that. Actual laughter." Roy raised an eyebrow. "This might actually work." Alex smirked. "Told you." And for the first time in a long time, things felt right. The restaurant had begun to empty, the hum of conversation dimming as diners paid their checks and filtered out into the cool evening air. A waiter cleared away the remains of Keith and Angela's dinner, the two of them still lingering at the table, sipping the last of their drinks. The laughter from earlier had settled into something quieter, something almost comfortable. Outside, however, Alex and Roy weren't feeling particularly at ease. Alex sat reading through the boring restaurant rules until he yawned while they waited for their parents to leave when something caught his attention. Across the street, standing near the valet station, was Beverly, and she wasn't alone. Roy followed his gaze, eyes narrowing as he took in the man standing beside her. He was tall, with an easy confidence, his casual blazer barely concealing the knowing smirk on his face. "Who's that?" Roy muttered. Alex, already unimpressed, tilted his head. "That, dear brother, is Nathan Carter. He's an actor. A bad one, if you ask me. Did some forgettable rom-com last year." Roy frowned. And what's he doing with Beverly? Too cozy, Alex muttered. This doesn't scream innocent dinner. Roy nodded. We should get closer. The brothers edged toward the corner of the bar, just within earshot. Beverly's voice drifted toward them, smooth, measured, and filled with an ease that made Alex's skin crawl. He adores me, she said, swirling her wine. The old fool thinks I actually want to marry him. Roy's stomach dropped. The actor chuckled. And after the wedding? What's the plan? Beverly tilted her head, her eyes gleaming. We take it slow. Keith is smart. I can't push too fast. But in a year, maybe 2, I'll have my share of everything. Alex clenched his fists. Roy, who was normally the level-headed one, was the first to act. We need proof, he whispered, eyes darting around. Neither of us has our phones. Alex swore under his breath, then spotted a young waiter behind the bar, cleaning glasses. His eyes lit up. Follow my lead. They approached the waiter, who barely looked up as they arrived. Hey, man, Alex said smoothly, leaning on the counter. Can we borrow your phone real quick? We need to call our mum, but ours died. The waiter hesitated. Roy jumped in, throwing in a worried frown. She's waiting for us outside, and if we don't check in, she'll freak out. Probably call the cops. The guy sighed, clearly debating whether it was worth the trouble. Finally, he handed over his phone. Make it quick. Roy took the phone, but instead of dialing, he subtly hit the film button. Alex smirked. Good thinking, genius. They turned back toward Beverly's table, holding the phone at an angle that wouldn't be obvious. Beverly, still unaware of them, continued. I mean, Keith's sweet, really, but he's predictable. He likes control, and I make him think he has it. That's all men want. Control and someone to stroke their ego. The actor laughed. And you? What do you want? Beverly smiled, slow and deliberate. A very comfortable life. That was enough. Roy ended the video and exhaled sharply. Let's go. Roy and Alex exchanged a glance. We're about to ruin her entire night, Alex said, barely containing his excitement. Roy smirked. Let's make it count. Inside the restaurant, Keith and Angela were finishing their meal. The awkwardness of the evening now replaced with something that almost felt normal. Then the door slammed open. Heads turned. Keith looked up, startled, just as Alex and Roy stormed in. Hey, Dad, Alex called across the room. We found something interesting. Keith's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Roy stepped forward, holding up the waiter's phone. We need you to hear this. Angela, sensing the shift in energy, sat up straighter. Beverly, who had just stepped into the restaurant to join Keith as coincidence, stiffened. Alex hit play. Beverly's voice filled the space, clear and damning. He adores me. The old fool thinks I actually want to marry him. Keith's face darkened. Beverly's expression barely flickered, but the color drained from her cheeks. And after the wedding? What's the plan? We take it slow. Keith is smart. I can't push too fast, but in a year, maybe 2, I'll have my share of everything. The restaurant was silent. Angela covered her mouth. Keith's jaw tightened, his grip on the table turning white-knuckled. The waiter, who had returned to grab a tray, suddenly perked up. Hey kids, that's my phone. Keith barely looked at him. I'll buy it. The waiter blinked. Wait, seriously? Keith pulled out the check was for $5,000 in his wallet and handed over. Take it and go. The waiter, now suddenly very invested in this drama, happily pocketed the cash and retreated. Beverly took a slow breath, then stepped forward, regaining her composure. Keith, she said smoothly, this is obviously... Keith cut her off. We're done. Beverly froze. Keith, did you think I was stupid? His voice was eerily calm. That I'd just sit here and let you play me? Beverly swallowed. You're overreacting. Keith stood. Beverly took a step back. "You have 5 minutes," he said, "to leave this restaurant and my life." Her lips parted, as if searching for a final defense, but she saw something in his face that made her realize it was useless. It was over. Alex grinned. Roy exhaled, satisfied. Beverly turned sharply on her heel and walked out, her head held high, but her steps too quick to be anything but rattled. Keith sat back down, running a hand over his face. Angela, still wide-eyed, finally spoke. "Well," Roy smirked, "that went well." Keith let out a slow breath, then turned to his sons. "You two," he said, shaking his head, "are a menace." Alex grinned. "You're welcome." And for the first time in a long time, Keith laughed. The next few weeks felt different, lighter, as if something that had been tense for so long had finally loosened, making space for something else, something real. Beverly was gone. No more calculating smiles, no more careful maneuvering. Keith had severed all ties without so much as a glance back, and though he hadn't said much about it, the shift was undeniable. With Beverly out of the picture, Keith and Angela had started talking again, not just about logistics, not just about Roy and Alex, but really talking. Angela wasn't sure what to make of it. She had spent years filing away her memories of Keith under complicated and irrelevant. He had been part of her past, someone she had moved on from, someone she had convinced herself she no longer knew. But now, seeing him like this, seeing him as Roy's father, Alex's father, as a man who wasn't the same one she had walked away from 9 years ago, it did something to her. Keith was different, she was different, and yet there was still something there. At Keith's penthouse, Alex was sprawled across the couch, flipping through channels without any real interest. He tossed the remote aside and looked over at his father, who was sitting at the kitchen counter, scrolling through emails. "So," Alex drawled, stretching lazily, "when are you taking my mum out on a real date?" Keith didn't even look up. "That's none of your business." Alex smirked. "That means you want to." Keith sighed, rubbing his temples. "Go do your homework." Alex grinned, but he didn't push further. Not yet, anyway. Meanwhile, at Angela's apartment, Roy sat cross-legged on the floor, watching as his mother typed furiously on her laptop. He tilted his head. "What are you writing?" Angela didn't pause, her fingers flying over the keys. "A screenplay." Roy raised an eyebrow. "About what?" Angela hesitated. Then slowly she looked over at him. "About us," she admitted. Roy blinked. "Like us?" Angela smiled softly. "Well, I'm taking some creative liberties, but yes, about 2 brothers who didn't know each other existed, about 2 parents who got lost in their own lives, about second chances." Roy absorbed that for a moment. "And how does it end?" Angela's smile faltered just slightly. "With them finding their way back to each other." Roy was quiet for a long moment. Then finally he grinned. "So it's a happy ending?" Angela exhaled, turning back to her screen. "I guess we'll see." Few months later, the film came together faster than Angela had expected. Something about the story, about their story, felt inevitable. The words poured out of her, the scenes forming effortlessly in her mind. And when she sent it out, the response was almost immediate. Studios wanted it. By the time the film was greenlit, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Casting, production, endless rewrites, it all moved so quickly. Before they knew it, the film was real. On the night of the premiere, Keith sat in the darkened theater, watching his life unfold on the screen. It was strange, seeing versions of themselves played by actors, watching their mistakes, their missed chances, their wounds laid bare for the world to see. But what struck him most wasn't the past, it was the ending. Angela had changed it. In the film, the parents, versions of them, didn't just reconnect for the sake of their sons. They fell back in love. They chose each other again. Keith's throat tightened. He barely noticed the way his fingers curled into fists, the way his breath slowed as the final scene played out. The four of them, together, whole. A family. A future. He swallowed hard. Angela sat 2 rows ahead, her silhouette illuminated by the glow of the screen. He watched her. Watched the way she leaned forward slightly, as if waiting for something. As if this mattered. And for the first time in a long, long time, Keith knew exactly what he wanted. The next day, Angela was at home, typing absent-mindedly, when there was a knock at the door. She frowned, glancing at the clock. Roy wasn't due home yet. She opened the door and froze. Keith stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at her the same way he had all those years ago. Except now, there was something else in his eyes. Something certain. Angela swallowed. Keith? He exhaled, then met her gaze. I don't want the movie's ending to be fiction. Angela's breath caught. Keith took a step closer. Tell me it's not too late. Angela stared at him, her heart pounding. Then, slowly, she smiled. And just like that, their real ending began. The evening air was thick with warmth, the golden glow of the dining room casting a soft light over the table. Outside, the city stretched beyond the wide windows, but inside, there was nothing but the sound of conversation, clinking dishes, and the occasional burst of laughter. For the first time in 9 years, they were all together, 1 year after the proposal of Keith. Angela moved through the kitchen, balancing a plate in one hand, while pouring a glass of wine with the other. Keith was at the stove, sleeves rolled up, pretending to be in control of the meal, while Maria, watching from the doorway, shook her head in amusement. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Angela teased, setting down the plate. Keith scoffed, stirring the pot with unnecessary confidence. Angela, please. I run a billion-dollar company. Cooking pasta is not beyond me. Uh-huh. She folded her arms, watching skeptically as he tasted the sauce. Behind them, Alex smirked. I think he just called himself a financial and culinary genius. What a guy. Roy, sitting cross-legged on the couch, grinned. I bet he's burning the sauce. Maria chuckled, stepping in before Keith could defend himself. Senor Howard, why don't you let me take over before you ruin dinner for everyone? Keith sighed dramatically, stepping aside. Fine, but only because I want the children to eat something edible. Angela rolled her eyes, but there was a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. Roy watched them closely, a strange feeling settling in his chest, something he hadn't realized he'd been missing until now. Family, not just in pieces, not just in phone calls or awkward arrangements. Here, together. Keith sat down across from him, exhaling as he ran a hand through his hair. So, big moment tonight, huh? Roy blinked. Huh? Keith smirked. Your big duet. You know, the one you two have been bickering about since the day you met. Alex leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Yeah. Try not to mess up, Roy. Roy narrowed his eyes. Try not to rush the tempo, Alex. Keith glanced between them, amused. So you two did inherit the stubborn gene. Angela set a dish on the table and raised an eyebrow. Oh, that one definitely comes from your side. Keith shot her a look. Excuse me? Alex grinned. Oh, this is great. Finally, someone who calls him out. Maria clapped her hands together, drawing everyone's attention. All right, niños. Before we start throwing food at each other, let's eat first, then the music. The meal was chaotic in the best way. Roy and Alex kept one-upping each other with ridiculous stories from school. Angela nearly spit out her wine, laughing at one of Keith's old college mishaps. And Keith, despite his protests, ended up telling embarrassing childhood stories about Alex. Maria watched with a knowing smile, as if she'd always expected things to end up like this. As the plates were cleared and the night grew deeper, Roy and Alex exchanged a glance. Time for the main event, Alex announced, stretching as he stood. Roy followed, adjusting his sleeves. "Try to keep up this time, Alex." Keith leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "All right, let's see what you've got." Angela settled beside him, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. Roy sat at the piano, fingers brushing the keys, while Alex lifted his violin, adjusting his stance. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then they played. At first it was careful, steady, like two people figuring each other out. Then it grew into something more, something fluid, something alive. The music filled the space, weaving between the walls, curling around them like a memory that had been waiting to surface. Keith and Angela sat side by side, their hands brushing against each other as the melody swelled. Neither pulled away. And as the final note rang out, as the room settled into silence, there was only one feeling left. Belonging. A family, once lost, now found. And this time, they weren't letting go. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.